Welcome to our deep dive. And this time we're tackling a period that's often kind of brushed over, those years between the world wars, 1914 to 1939, the interwar years. But I can already tell from the stack of readings you sent, and we're talking historical narratives, some serious theory here that you're looking for way more than just a what happened when timeline.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. What makes the interwar period so fascinating is it's like a masterclass in how entire systems on a global scale can just fail. We're not just talking events here. It's about watching the old world order crumble and then, well, the new one not quite getting built right.
It's like trying to build a house, but the foundation's still half crumbled from the earthquake, right?
Yeah.
Recipe for disaster. And I guess that's what we're going to use all these sources for, to figure out where the cracks were, how they formed. But even before that, we have to get World War I itself, because that wasn't just a war. It ripped up the whole rule book on how global politics was played.
Absolutely. One of the articles you sent even called it the suicide of 19th century Europe. Not an exaggeration when you think about it. Empires that had lasted for centuries, gone Ottomans, Habsburgs, Romanovs, wiped off the map, and the map of Europe itself redrawn entirely.
And the old way of doing things, I think you mentioned balance of power diplomacy before.
Yeah.
That went out the window too. For those of us who didn't major in diplomacy, what did that actually look like pre-war?
Okay, imagine a bunch of kids on a seesaw, right? Constantly shifting their weight to keep it balanced. That's basically how the great powers in Europe used to operate. Alliances were always forming and breaking. The goal was to make sure nobody got too powerful and tipped the whole thing over.
So Europe's already doing this balancing act. Things are tense. And then, bam, World War I hits. Seesaw breaks.
But it's not just the war itself, it's the way it was fought. Like you said, industrial-scale warfare, machine guns, poison gas, trench warfare, those technologies resulted in casualties unlike anything the world had ever seen. Over 10 million dead. Entire generation traumatized, and people started questioning, well, everything.
Plus, you've got the Russian Revolution happening right in the middle of it all in 1917. Suddenly, communism's on the world stage, a whole new ideology challenging the established order. And then there's America, joins the war late, becomes a major player. The balance of power starts shifting away from Europe altogether. So it's not just a broken seesaw anymore. It's like someone threw the whole thing in a blender.
Yeah, a pretty messy blender for sure. Which brings us to 1919 and the Treaty of Versailles. The victors try to put the pieces back together, and, well, let's just say they didn't exactly create a masterpiece.
Yeah, the big four, as they called them, U.S., Britain, France, Italy, they were basically calling all the shots. Germany, the loser, gets slammed with huge reparations, loses territory, has to take the blame for the whole war. Seems like that'd breed some serious resentment no matter what. Was there no effort at all to make a lasting peace?
Oh, there were attempts, but it's complicated. One of the books you sent actually focuses on Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. He was the U.S. president at the time, and had this really idealistic vision, self-determination for all nations, a league of nations to prevent future wars.
Sounds great in theory, but did it actually work?
Not really. The rest of Europe, especially France, wasn't exactly in the mood for idealism. They wanted to punish Germany and weren't too worried about the long-term consequences. Plus, even Wilson's ideas weren't perfect, that whole national self-determination thing. The treaty tried to apply it, but did it so inconsistently that it created just as many problems as it solved. New countries popped up, but tons of them had their own ethnic tensions baked in, which made them unstable from the get-go.
Okay, so the treaty's signed, but there's already this simmering resentment, especially from Germany. And on top of that, you've got the League of Nations, this big hope for preventing another war. How'd that go?
Well, noble idea, but flawed from the start. For one thing, the U.S., which had been a major advocate for it, didn't even join. Isolationist sentiment back home kept them out. And the League itself had no real teeth, no way to actually enforce its decisions, needed unanimous votes for action, good luck getting that, and mostly relied on economic sanctions, which, let's be honest, weren't very effective.
So it's basically a bunch of countries sitting around a table, politely asking each other to behave. No wonder it didn't really work. Plus, wasn't the League stuck trying to uphold a treaty that a lot of countries already hated?
You've hit on a key point. The League ended up being more about maintaining the status quo, even a flawed one, than actually preventing conflict. And while the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, did have a period of relative stability, it was all built on pretty shaky ground.
Right, the 1920s weren't all doom and gloom. Economic growth, cultural change, jazz, flappers.
True. But one of your books on economic history points out just how fragile that prosperity was. Global economy was still recovering from the war, and there were deep structural problems, especially in the financial system. Plus, under the surface, resentment was building in Germany and elsewhere.
So it's like everyone's at this fancy party having a good time, but the music's about to stop, and nobody really knows what to do when it does.
That's a great analogy. And as we'll see in the next part of our deep dive, when the music did stop in 1929 with the Great Depression, the whole facade came crashing down.
This is already fascinating, and a bit unsettling given what we know comes next. But before we move on to the Great Depression and how that paved the road to World War II, I want to pause and see if there's anything you, our listener, want to highlight. What stood out to you so far in this story of a world trying to rebuild itself and maybe not doing such a great job? All right, we're back, and it feels like we're at this really crucial moment, like a crossroads. The old world order is shattered, but the new one's, I don't know, still under construction. And there's all these different architects arguing about the blueprints.
That's a great way to put it. One of the sources actually talks about this clash between competing international orders. You've got the remnants of the old balance of power system, but then this new idea of collective security with the League of Nations. But neither one really has a solid grip on things.
So it's two dance partners, both trying to lead, but they keep stepping on each other's toes.
Exactly. And then to make things even more complicated, you have these completely different ideologies that are battling it out at the same time.
Yeah.
Liberal democracy, it seemed like it had won the day after World War I, but suddenly it's facing some serious challengers. Communism in the Soviet Union, and then fascism gaining ground in places like Italy and Germany.
Right, so now you've got this, ideological triangle, each side with its own completely different vision of how the world should work. Did that make it even harder for the international system to find its footing?
Absolutely. Think about it from the perspective of the liberal democracies, right? They're trying to promote international cooperation, collective security through the League of Nations. But they're also super suspicious of the Soviet Union, which is, actively promoting communist revolution around the world.
It's like trying to build a house while someone keeps setting fire to the lumberyard.
Yeah. Exactly. And then you have the fascists who reject both liberalism and communism. They're all about national strength, authoritarianism, and, very often, aggressive expansion. Not exactly a recipe for international harmony, right?
So you have these deep ideological divisions, and then on top of that, the global economy is still shaky after the war. It seems like the 1920s were this period of trying to paper over the cracks, but the foundation was already crumbling.
One of the economic history books you sent really drives that point home. It argues that a lot of the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties, it was based on debt and speculation. Countries were borrowing heavily to rebuild. And there was this sense that, the good times would just keep rolling.
But of course, they didn't. When the U.S. stock market crashes in 1929,
Right.
It's like that Jenga tower we were talking about before finally collapses completely.
The Great Depression, it was a global catastrophe. Exposed how fragile the international economic system really was, led to widespread suffering, unemployment, social unrest, and it had a huge impact on the political landscape, too.
Right, because that's where we see those extremist ideologies we were talking about before starting to gain even more traction. People are desperate. They want answers. They're more willing to listen to anyone who promises solutions, even if those solutions are, dangerous.
Exactly. The Nazis in Germany are a perfect example. They exploited the economic crisis, all that resentment towards the Treaty of Versailles, to gain power, promising to restore German greatness.
So the Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a political and social crisis as well. It basically accelerated the breakdown of that already fragile interwar order and created the conditions for something much, much worse.
Which brings us to the big question we'll be exploring in the next part. How did all these failures of the interwar period directly lead to the outbreak of World War II?
But before we jump into that, I'm curious what you think, listening in. We've covered a lot: shattered world order, ideological battles, a global economic crisis. What stands out to you as the most crucial turning point, or maybe the biggest missed opportunity in this story so far? Let's take a moment to reflect on that before we dive into those events that led to the Second World War. All right, we're back. And honestly, after that last part, I'm not sure I'm ready for this. I mean, we've been talking about a world in chaos, systems breaking down, these dangerous ideologies on the rise.
Yeah.
It feels like we're on this, runaway train headed straight for disaster.
It's definitely a bleak picture. And one of the sources you sent, this book on the origins of World War II, it makes a really interesting argument. It says that the war wasn't inevitable, exactly, but it was made much more likely by this whole series of bad choices, missteps along the way.
So it's not just about the huge structural forces we talked about, but how individual leaders, countries, reacted to them, right? Their decisions mattered.
Exactly. And one of the key factors here, the failure of appeasement. We're talking 1930s now. Hitler's Germany is getting more and more aggressive. And Britain and France, they adopt this policy of appeasement, figuring if they give Hitler some of what he wants, it'll prevent a bigger war.
It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, though, isn't it?
Well, their logic was if they could satisfy Hitler's ambition so, letting him annex Austria, parts of Czechoslovakia, that maybe he'd be content and stop there. Obviously, it didn't work.
One of your sources, a biography on Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time, it talks about how he genuinely thought he could reason with Hitler. He even made that famous Peace for Our Time declaration after meeting with him in Munich in 1938.
But Hitler saw it as weakness. Appeasement just emboldened him to push even further. He reoccupied the Rhineland, rearmed Germany, totally violating the Treaty of Versailles, and by 1939, he's got his eyes on Poland.
And that's the final straw, right? Germany invades Poland in September 1939. Britain and France finally declare war. World War II begins.
It's a tragic turning point, and it really shows how all the failures of the interwar period, they basically set the stage for this global catastrophe. You have the Treaty of Versailles, which created all this resentment and instability. Then the Great Depression comes along and fuels those extremist movements we talked about. And the League of Nations, it just couldn't effectively deal with any of it. So yeah, the world was basically left wide open for another devastating conflict.
It's honestly kind of a scary reminder how fragile peace really is, how easily things can fall apart when countries stop cooperating. And those aggressive ideologies, they take root and spread.
One thing that really strikes me is how interconnected it all was. The political stuff, the economic crisis, the ideological battles, they all feed into each other. And it shows how the decisions leaders made back in the interwar years, those consequences, they rippled out way beyond their own time.
We started this whole deep dive comparing the interwar years to a house built on a shaky foundation. And that seems more and more accurate the further we get. Those cracks were there all along, and eventually, yeah, the whole structure collapsed.
And the way things were rebuilt after World War II, that's just as important as anything that happened during those interwar years. Because we've seen what happens when a peace treaty, it doesn't actually solve the underlying problems. It just sets the stage for the next conflict.
Well, this has been a truly, I'd say, thought-provoking journey, and I want to thank you for helping us make sense of such a complicated and important period in history.
Happy to do it. And for you listening, I hope this deep dive has given you, a fresh perspective on the interwar years, and maybe even some food for thought about the challenges we're facing in our own time.
The interwar period shows us, more than anything, that peace isn't something we just get automatically. It's something we have to actively work for, constantly. And that's a lesson we should never forget.
Absolutely. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning.